That was the moment that really planted the seed for Yvon, that's understood, I, as an individual and as a citizen, can make an impact. And B, and this is critical, the money that I generate from my company can go towards something bigger than myself and my friends and whatever material goods or experiences we might want in the immediate. That the money generated from this company can actually serve a bigger cause.
Walk into any Patagonia store. Within 30 seconds, you'll know what they stand for. The recycled materials, the repair station, the climbing photos, the employee who actually uses the gear, everything tells the same story. This is a company founded by climbers who once hand-forged their own carabiners because the existing ones weren't good enough. That obsessive commitment to craft, that love of wild places, that refusal to compromise, it radiates from every surface. But how much do you know about how this magic trick was done? I'm Eric Ries, and today I'm joined by David Gelles, New York Times climate correspondent, Emmy and Loeb Award-winning journalist, and best-selling author of The Man Who Broke Capitalism and the forthcoming Dirtbag Billionaire, his new book on the reclusive but utterly fascinating founders of the multi-billion-dollar success story that is Patagonia. David takes us inside Patagonia's extraordinary story, how a reluctant businessman and dirtbag climber turned blacksmith built one of the most trusted companies in the world while refusing to play by the financial system's rules. We explore the radical choice to never take on outside investors, the creation of Patagonia's unique trust structure, and how this one company managed to resist the corrosive logic of shareholder primacy, decade after decade after decade. But this isn't just a history lesson. David and I also wrestle with the massive change unfolding right now as AI rewires the structure of the internet and challenges our assumptions about how corporations are built and run. How exactly can we build companies for this new era that can stay true to their ethos over generations? And how can founders design companies that transmit their mission, not just maximize their short-term profits? David is a fascinating person, a really interesting writer, and a great interview. He has the historical perspective and, having gone deep into Patagonia, an opportunity to take us inside this iconic company. Please enjoy this conversation with David Gelles.
All right. Well, David, thank you very much for making time.
Thanks for having me.
So, the other day I was talking to somebody about a totally unrelated topic, just a civilian, not from the startup or business world at all. And they were telling me a story about two people that they had met, and they wanted me to understand something about them. And they just said, look, they both work at Patagonia. So therefore, and then they went on with their story. And I was supposed to understand in context that the fact they worked at Patagonia told me basically everything I could possibly need to know about these two people, that they obviously knew how to go camping, that they obviously had really strong ethics and values, that of course they cared about the environment. It was like a really striking example. I knew I was going to be talking to you, and I really had it in my mind like that there's something about Patagonia that it stands for something so definite in people's minds. I just thought it's like really an incredible company. And yet most people I know, like even though everyone's seen the products, everyone's walked by the store, people know the brand really well, very few people I talk to actually know very much about the company and how it was built, how it works behind the scenes. And so when I saw that you were working on this book, I was very excited. Not just because I think people will find the book really fascinating, but just because I think it's a really interesting and unheralded company. And I wonder if you have a theory as to why that is.
Well, thank you for that cool introduction. And there's so many entry points, but just to try to address that sort of specific question at the end, why is it perhaps that a company that so many of us sort of are familiar with still is in many ways so unknown? And sort of what makes Patagonia so special, especially those parts of it are perhaps unheralded, as you said. I think some of it probably just has to do with the fact that it's a relatively small company. When we think about sort of big companies in the world, these are often companies with hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue. Patagonia has like $1 billion in annual revenue. So it's small by many conventional metrics. And
the other really interesting definition of small, but okay. All right. I'm with you.
Yeah. And another piece of it, I would say, is that Yvon Chouinard, who founded Patagonia more than 50 years ago, has always had a very conflicted relationship with fame and with attention, even, in the simplest sense of the word. He wasn't necessarily comfortable with this book and me writing it at times. And I think that sort of reticence, this conflicted relationship with how public they want to be about everything, probably has contributed to them not being out there in force in the world in some of the ways that you might expect from other big companies.
It's such a fascinating contrast, especially because we all know so many, especially in tech, billionaires and these very successful founders who they crave attention more than anything. It just seems like no matter how rich they get, it's never enough unless they also have, public accolades. And even they're just incredibly thin skinned, like they feel like they're oppressed if anyone criticizes. It's just like, it's really wild to me how money does that to people's brains. And of course, I've been around a lot of people build a lot of companies. So I've been around a lot of people who've gone through that transformation, and it's kind of sad. And so it's such a striking contrast. Maybe tell us a little bit about why, like, have you developed a sense of his psychology and why he has been able to, have all this wealth and power come to him without embracing it, and without letting it kind of ruin his life?
One quote that I often think of, and I don't know the origin, but we could probably find it pretty easily, is someone once said, money makes people more of who they already are. And it's this sense that, the richer you get, the more it sort of distills this core personality. And of course, it can change you, and maybe, you transform. But at a certain level, I think this theory definitely applies to Yvon Chouinard. I've spent a lot of time thinking about who this man is, what allowed him to sort of create the company he did and live the life he did, and ultimately make the decisions about his wealth that he did late in his career. And the thing that blew me away, as I read literally every interview I could ever find with him that he'd ever given in his life, is the consistency. This man was using the same phrases, was coming back to the same values, was understanding the world in the same way 50 years ago and even 60 years ago, before he founded Patagonia, as he still does today. And that level of sort of manic consistency, and you used the word values earlier, the relentless and sort of unwavering commitment to the same set of values, I think never changed, and ultimately led him to a place where, when he did suddenly find himself on the Forbes billionaires list, it didn't compromise his own sense of who he was.
I've been using the word ethos a lot lately, that it's like people can have a personal ethos that's, their kind of deeper character, or what what they really stand for. And that can, under the right circumstances, translate into a corporate ethos. You can actually build a company that is a reflection of that deep character. But most companies do not have an ethos. Both companies, they have a culture, they have a character, but they're either totally incoherent, or they're kind of paper tigers, like when pushed, they will collapse, or they're very vulnerable to external pressure.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of break this story down into these two arcs, if you will. Like, one is, how did he develop that personal ethos? Like, tell us his story a little bit, since he isn't that well known individually. And then I especially am interested in how he was able to translate that into a corporate ethos that, as you say, only makes $1 billion a year. But that, I can tell you, that is enough to corrupt quite a lot of companies that I am aware, that lose that ethos in the face of the pressure and the temptation that level of success brings. So let's do the first arc. Let's talk about his personal ethos and where it came from.
Sure. So Yvon Chouinard was born in rural Maine in 1938. And as I say at the start of the book, if you think about it, yes, we were well into the 20th century, but that little corner of the world really hadn't changed much in, call it 10,000 years. He lived in the woods, and electricity was around, but he lived on a family farm where they often lived off the land. It was a really a childhood that brought him incredibly close to nature. And from an early age, he was spending his time in the woods. He was spending his time fishing. And while sort of all the things in America that were being celebrated, that were sort of creating this vision of what we thought the 20th century had to offer, he from an early age sort of rejected it. When other people were going to be engineers and sort of help put men on the moon, he literally had this fantasy that he was going to be a fur trapper like his Canadian forebears, back from the 1700s. Wow. Like, he never accepted modernity at this deep level. And so that innate sense of him as an individual, as someone who was connected to the planet more than to modern society, followed him into teenage years and early adulthood, where he became a real outdoorsman. And he became one of the world's pioneering rock climbers in the 1950s, putting up these first ascents on the granite walls of Yosemite and the Tetons in Wyoming. So much so, and he was pushing the edge so far that he had to start building his own tools because the equipment he could buy that was being imported from Europe just wasn't good enough. And so he started becoming a blacksmith, taught himself how to be a blacksmith. Again, sort of like our archaic profession.
Who does that?
In a world when
oh my God.
we had computer engineers by this point. He was learning how to be a blacksmith, starts making his own climbing equipment.
So this is how a lot of role-playing games start, like in a medieval setting, with your skill tree, and you build your tools and you forge your thing. I mean, it's just, such a throwback story.
Exactly. And that then that ultimately led from blacksmithing into apparel making, where he understood at a certain point that the market for climbing gear was only so big and the market for clothing was much, much larger. And that in fact, there was a need for a certain type of clothes that he couldn't buy. Just like he couldn't find climbing gear that was good enough for the climbs he needed to do, the right carabiners and pitons and chocks and hexes. He realized that when he was pushing the limits with these deep expeditions into the wilderness, multi-week journeys into cold Arctic places, he didn't have the clothes that were keeping him and his friends safe. And so that then led him on this path of trying to create a new base layering system, new types of materials that would actually keep him warm in the cold places that he was going to for these expeditions. And that led to sort of the breakthroughs that started to get Patagonia on this path of becoming a real big and enduring concern.
Okay, but I want to take you back because I feel like you skipped over an important moment there. We started out with him rejecting modernity and basically living in the woods and living on his fur trapping fantasy and then becoming a rock climber. And I get the idea that he became a blacksmith and made his own tools. And then you're like, but he realized the market was bigger. And I was like, wait a second. How did a person like this even come into contact with our market economy? So distant from our modern, like that. I feel like that's a very modern story. Oh, a person has an idea. They make a product. Sure. They expand the market. So where did that come from? Like, when did he start? When did he go from like making things for himself to selling it to others? Like, was there a moment when he realized that this would have to be embodied as a company for some reason? And the reason I ask that is because the most modern idea of all is that we don't make things ourselves anymore. We embody the making of a thing into a supply chain. And then the supply chain produces for us and for everybody like us the same thing. Well, fur trappers did not produce that way. That would not be the fur trapper
right.
mindset. So I'm just curious, like, do you get a sense of where the economics or the kind of like the modern, I don't know what to call it, this modern ethos kind of gets blended in there?
Yeah, I think there's a few touch points. And with, as with any entrepreneurial story, it's never quite as tidy as historians might want to make it seem. But listen, I would point to a few really seminal moments. The first was that when he started making his climbing equipment, he really started making it for himself and his friends because they needed gear that they could use on their climbs. At a certain point, though, he realized that their stuff was better than everyone else's. And if they sold it, he could make a little money and not have to worry about other jobs. So there was like, I can just, and he literally sold it out of the back of his car. He would hammer away at the anvil during the winter months when it was too cold to climb. And then he would stuff his trunk with the gear he had made, head up to the mountains and do his climbs. And when the day was over, you'd find the other climbers and sell them stuff out of the back of his trunk. So that was the beginning of the climbing business. And listen, I also don't want to understate the degree to which, while he was never a conventionally trained businessman, he never went to business school, never graduated from college, he had really sharp business and entrepreneurial instincts from the outset. Some people just have it. Some people can understand a market, identify it. He was one of those men, those women who could just see he had the sense. So he knew just intuitively how to scale at certain times. But then what happened when he made this pivot to clothing, that actually involves the story of one of his best friends and the founder of a couple other iconic brands, a guy named Doug Tompkins, who founded both the North Face, big competitor to Patagonia, and Esprit, one of the biggest clothing companies of the 80s and 90s. These guys were best friends, climbing buddies from an early age. And it was really Doug who already was having success with the Esprit, who pushed Yvon to make Patagonia and say he was the sort of bug in Yvon's ears who was telling him, the climbing business is fine, but if you really want to have a big business, clothing is the way to go. Yvon resisted at first. He didn't want to do it. He didn't think that he could really make a contribution. But then it was actually during this 1968 trip that the two of them and a couple other buddies took down in South America. They got trapped in an ice cave for 30 days as they waited to scale this summit called Fitzroy.
Wow.
And in that time, two things happened. One, their clothing just wouldn't stand up to the elements. And Yvon was like freezing and wet. And at the same time, Doug's in his ear badgering him to make a clothing company. He gets back from that trip and sort of realizes that Doug was right. And soon after that, starts making the clothing company. And it's actually that trip inspired both the name Patagonia, because they were in the region Patagonia, and also the Patagonia logo. That little silhouette of mountains, that's the mountain that they climbed
where they were.
On that trip in 1968.
I mean, you got to love a bunch of guys who are trapped in an ice cave for 30 days and like are not worried about whether they're going to survive coming out of the ice cave, but thinking about when they get home, they're going to start a business to make sure that the next time they're not cold and wet. What a story. So is that the moment that it went from a kind of out of the back of his car to like some kind of modern enterprise?
So there were again like micro beats in between. The climbing business achieved some success on its own. So it was called Chouinard Equipment, and this was just climbing gear for alpinists. And they were making not only handmade pitons and chocks and carabiners, sort of the tools of the trade for climbers, but he understood well enough, again, this sort of innate entrepreneurial sense, that he could find a bigger market by reselling things like anoraks and climbing shoes and hats. So he started reselling other stuff at, small margin, small markup. And so the climbing business itself had its own catalog, its own customer base. And he and a friend, they scaled it for several years. Tom Frost was the name of the business partner. Again, you talk about these entrepreneurial pairings. Tom Frost, he was literally a engineer from Stanford who knew how to build rockets. He was literally just a mechanical engineering genius. And when he was paired, and a very good climber, and when he was paired with Yvon, who had this innate design sense, this real deep sensibility that allowed him to sort of get to the essence of a product, the two of them made what are still regarded as some of the finest climbing products ever to have been made for that generation. So the climbing business has scaled, but then boom, they start rolling out their first Patagonia clothing, things like stand-up shorts, these still boxy shorts. I still wear a pair from now and then. Their first sort of synthetic piled jackets. And there is where they start to see these real step change orders roll in and start to get a financial degree of success that the climbing business was just never going to afford them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, today, Patagonia is known for its social stands and its mission and like I said, in this kind of corporate ethos. But what was it like in the early days? Like, how did they conceive of what the project was? And when did it transition from we're just going to use this to support ourselves so we can be climbing full time, basically, to something else? Yeah,
again, it's an evolution. But the real seminal moment, I think, comes right at the very origin of Patagonia, right in the same few months when he's actually starting the clothing company as an official concern. He hears about this plan to dam the Ventura River, which is just like a creek that runs behind the office. And on the one hand, most people would pay no mind to that, right? Like little civic development in the backyard, whatever, not my problem. But he hears that it might disrupt the surf break in Ventura Bay, which is the thing that drew him to Ventura in the first place. And he goes ballistic. He's like, I'm not going to let them muck up my surf break. So he starts funding with just a few small checks a local activist named Mark Capelli. And the two of them essentially gin up this resistance campaign to the project. He ultimately gets it blocked. So they don't do the project to dam the river. They ultimately show that whereas the county had contended that the river was effectively dead, they start finding that steelhead are still spawning in microscopic opportunities in the river. And boom, they preserve the river. They preserve the surf break. And it's not a direct line at that point to oh, now I'm an activist. But that was the moment that really planted the seed for Yvon, that's understood, I, as an individual and as a citizen, can make an impact. And B, and this is critical, the money that I generate from my company can go towards something bigger than myself and my friends and whatever material goods or experiences we might want in the immediate. That the money generated from this company can actually serve a bigger cause. So that was the first moment. And then again, lots of little moments along the way. And then we get to things in recent years like, oh my gosh, they're suing President Trump. They're leading get out the vote efforts, big national level actions to try to sway environmental policy in the United States.
Yeah. Is that the origin of Let My People Surf, by the way?
Yeah. I mean, that's a term. So his original sort of self-help memoir, it's sort of a hybrid business book, little memoir in there. It was called Let My People Go Surfing. And that, that speaks to his contention and a reality in the early days of the business that if the waves were good, everyone had the right to put down whatever it is they were doing at the office and go surf. And that, that there was a lot of truth to that. That ethos is still present, though maybe not quite as ideologically adhered to in the office these days. There are big important meetings happening at the office these days. I don't know if you can really just throw down whatever it is you're doing and go surf. But, this is a company that always liked to believe it paid real mind to the kind of culture, you used that word earlier in the conversation, culture, and to the needs and sort of concerns of the people that worked there.
So I want to get into the story of how it was constructed, but I can't help thinking that this book that you're writing, it's kind of a really interesting bookend with the book you wrote before about Jack Welch and the rise of shareholder primacy doctrine. And this is really the moment that captured my attention as I was thinking about you telling the story, that so many people I know, even if they begin quite idealistic and really have a social change purpose, but honestly, even if they just want to make, I love this because it's a story that starts out at just wanting to make great products and like have them not break. And even just in our world today, the intention to build a company that makes great products and serves customers is already such a radical act. Because so many people, they get into even the tiniest level of success, and then this idea takes over their enterprise. This idea to maximize shareholder value is kind of like the reason why the company exists. That is its purpose as a corporation. And what's funny to me about these debates is we pretend that, if you say like, I think a corporation should have a purpose, people already are like, well, no. Corporations have no purpose. It's like, hold on, the purpose to maximize shareholder returns is a purpose. You can say that it's not a purpose, but it is. And in fact, most companies today in Delaware are incorporated, as you well know. It just says the purpose is to engage in any lawful act. And yet somehow any lawful act means any lawful act that will increase the value of shareholders. And most people I know are not aware of how recent this change in corporate philosophy is. It's in living memory. It's not like some ancient thing. And so I wonder, and we can talk about the arc of history about it, but since we're in the middle of this Patagonia story, I'm curious, like, how did the brainworm not take over Patagonia like that? I could just see that. I know so many people who, if they were in that exact same situation with the success and the ethos and everything, the first time they started using the company's resources for some social cause or social purpose, they'd have all kinds of people in their ear being like, you've made a category error. First, what you need to do is go become a billionaire, then retire or sell your company, and then maybe you can do some philanthropy or whatever at the end. But in the meantime, if your enterprise contradicts your own values and does things as a side effect that you abhor, that's kind of the deal. That's what it means to have a company. So how is this avoided in that circumstance?
This is really the heart of the whole book. And it's one of the reasons I've been so captivated by this company's story for years now. I've been writing about Patagonia for 10 years more, known Yvon that long, and have really charted closely how it is that they have sort of cut this different path through the wilds of late capitalism, which are just like, as you said, like completely bananas in so many ways, no matter how you look at it. And so unjust and unethical. I mean, like, pick your adverb and it probably can stick. But the answer is really simple. In this case, it's not a formula that will work for everyone, but it's, I think, in many ways, a baseline for any company that wants to have a chance of doing it this righteously, as Patagonia did. And that is the fact that they never gave up any equity. Patagonia, Yvon Chouinard never took a dime of outside funding, even when they were up against the ropes, even when they were facing bankruptcy, even when they couldn't pay their staff and were facing a severe financial crisis and to lay people off and were getting pressured by bankers to take on outside equity. They never, ever, ever caved. And as a result, that allowed Chouinard to really resist those temptations. Full stop. And even to the end, and the end, for the purposes of the equity story of the company, ends 3 years ago when he literally gives away all the equity. And we can talk about that in some detail if you want. Up until that point, the entirety of the voting shares and the non-voting shares were held by Chouinard, his wife, and their 2 children. And that was it. Mm-hmm. And that alone is remarkable, right? To scale a company.
So, but that just begs the question, well, why did they do that? Like, again, the temptation to do that must have been immense. Why?
Here we come back to who this guy was. He was never tempted. He was a dirtbag, which, is a term in the climbing community and the outdoors community. This is an affectionate term for someone who's so unenamored with material possessions that they're happy to sleep in the dirt. But he was a dirtbag from the time he was a kid. And along these ways, that when people came to him with a big check, he would sort of scoff at it. There were times when he considered selling. And indeed, as I report in the book, there were times when he didn't accept an offer because he thought it was too low. So it's not like he was dogmatic in his understanding of the outcomes all the way. But his friend Doug Tompkins was that voice in his ear that was doing exactly what you suggested earlier, that so many people say, which is like, sell the company, make a bunch, use it for whatever you want. Yvon just always kept saying no. And it was because he never wanted the money for himself. Now, full disclosure, he lives a nice life. He has a home in Jackson Hole. He has a home in Ventura. He travels a lot. He goes fishing. Also, full disclosure, this guy does not live luxuriously. I've been to his home. He cooks off a cast iron skillet he bought 50 years ago. He picked me up in a 1999 Toyota hatchback. Like, he reuses Ziploc bags. Right? Like, I was with him in Argentina. The guy travels with a couple pairs of underwear. This is not a luxurious minded man at all. So to come back to this idea of why didn't he take that equity when it was presented to him? It's because I think he didn't want the money. That really wasn't what was motivating him. And he understood, again, you get this baseline entrepreneurial savvy. He understood that it would be corrupting at some level. And he didn't want to let Patagonia get corrupted.
I know you're not inside his head, but you spent a lot of time imagining life. How would he have defined corruption? You say he doesn't want to be corrupted. How would he have defined that word?
That's a great question. Again, I can't pretend to speak for him, but I think what I heard from him in my many hours of conversations and what I've read and, everything I've ever found that he's ever said is that he really has a very almost black and white sense of morality in corporate America. And he, in his mind, really believes that when companies start prioritizing profits for the sake of profits, almost every other concern goes out the window, even if they, try to hold on to the rhetoric that they care about something else. From what he's seen, in so many other companies, when executives start thinking about their own wealth, when executives start thinking about shareholder returns, it becomes just anathema to think about things like the quality of the products at a deep and holistic level. It becomes almost inconceivable to think about maybe making less profit because we want to make sure that the workers in our tier 2 supplier factories are well taken care of. But when you don't care about those things, like money and shareholder returns, suddenly it's a whole lot easier to say, we're not going to do certain corporate activities if it means that it's going to pollute a river in Portugal. We're not going to pursue a particular business line if it means we have to use unethical labor from a region in China that we're not comfortable with. Saying no to those kind of things suddenly becomes almost like second nature. And that, I think, is the way he would define what it means to be corrupted.
I think it's such a sad commentary on the state of our world now that people take it for granted and maybe are right that it's not possible with our current corporate structures to take on any kind of investment without bringing that corruption into the organism. And I really wonder, is there go ahead.
I wanted this to be a conversation because this is something you've thought so deeply about. I mean, with the long-term stock exchange, and we can get back to Patagonia whenever you want.
Sure.
But yeah. I'm curious, because this is the perfect moment in the conversation. What would you have said to him to make him believe that something like the long-term stock exchange or any other corporate transaction, other than just holding on to it himself for all these years, wouldn't have corrupted the company? Is it possible?
Well, I'm happy to talk about it because I do think this is a significant problem in the world today. And the way we structure most companies, they're really designed to become corrupted. Like that is the outcome. Jim Sinegal, founder of Costco, put it. He called it basically like you become a heroin addict. And so whatever your other commitments or values are, like you can't keep them anymore. You want to, you mean to, you'll even put on a good show about it. And it's funny because business books and business best practices are very much about consistency. You create brand through consistency and consistent operations and quality. And it's just so funny to me because a drug addict is the most consistent person you'll ever meet. And we know for sure what they're going to do. It's actually super consistent, very predictable, but that doesn't engender trust. Right. And to me, trustworthiness is the most valuable asset in business. And the Patagonia story shows it at so many turns that you develop this asset. It's not on your books. Our current accounting systems are blind to it. So the current OKR system that we teach people to use in management has this fatal flaw that any person in the organization at any time can make their quarter, make their personal numbers go up by trading against the trustworthiness of the whole enterprise. So it's like you have this hidden account that you can spend, and you don't notice that it's gone until it's gone. So yeah, I don't think it's possible. Now, I also don't think it would have been possible to talk him out of the structure that he adopted, because at the time, I don't think he would have even known what the alternatives were. He didn't figure out the perpetual purpose trust, and we'll get to that part of the story, obviously, 3 years ago, until very late in his life. But what's fascinating to me, and obviously this is part of the thesis of LTSE, is that there are these models out there of alternative ways to structure a for-profit company such that it can take investment without losing its soul, without falling to corruption. And depending on how you count in the world today, companies with these quote unquote alternative structures run between, 5 and 10% of world GDP. So it's not like no one's ever heard of them. People have heard of Vanguard and they've heard of Hershey and, I've shopped at IKEA and, they've gone to these places. And of course they've shopped at Patagonia. And yet, for whatever reason, the way we teach people to build companies is we teach these as these one-off examples that are not worthy of emulation.
Right.
So even when, and this is what I was worried about with the story of Patagonia. I mean, I've obviously been advancing this thesis for a while now, and I've talked to a lot of founders into adopting these alternative structures. But a very common thing I hear from people, they say, well, sure, that works in Europe. I've heard vaguely that in Denmark, this is a really common structure. So yeah, if I was in Denmark, it would work for me. And I'm like, well, Vanguard, Hershey, and Patagonia are in America. So what's up? And it's just oh yeah, I never thought of it. REI, that's an American company, right? There's one right down the street. You could buy your Patagonia fleece there. These things are hidden in plain sight. And so part of what I'm excited about with your book is that I think that we've basically made an error, a social, society level error. And it doesn't have, this is wild to me, it has no democratic legitimacy. So just if you don't mind the quick history lesson for our viewers who are not as deep in this as you are, the most prosperous era in American history by far was the interregnum in between the rise of what was called general incorporation in the very late 19th century. So for people's context, general incorporation is the idea that people should be allowed to incorporate companies for any reason. Before that, every company had to have a socially defined purpose and to be approved by a state legislature. It's very difficult to get permission to start a corporation. Delaware didn't adopt the full general incorporation law till 1899. Okay, so this is not some ancient history. This is relatively recent. So between 1899 and the rise of shareholder primacy as a theory is the most prosperous part of American history. And whereas general incorporation was enacted by state legislatures, the idea of shareholder primacy has never been subject to any democratic referendum ever in history. It was never enacted by any legislature. It is not a law of Congress. If you're looking in the statutes for, you will not find it. It was decided in courtrooms, in academic legal theories, and in boardrooms. It was an elite consensus that we should just decide that this is the purpose of a corporation. And it only happened in the late 70s. I mean, depending on who you ask, Jack Welch didn't start really doing it in earnest at GE until what? The early 80s. So again, not ancient history. And the world has absolutely gone off the rails since then. And so I don't think it's some kind of like crazy theory to say, wait a minute, we had like not even a century of this tremendous prosperity that seemed to work really well.
Yeah.
And we had corporate forms that matched, and we kind of kicked one of the legs of the stool out. And now the whole thing is wobbling and collapsing. Like maybe we could just undo that wrong turn. And so if you go back to 1968, that's what I think is so remarkable about the Patagonia story is like, it's very obvious now how bad this has turned out. But in 1968, it would have seemed like a very much an open question. So I think it's even more interesting that he didn't get swept up in that mania that took our entire elite class with it, not only a few years later.
Well, and I think you raise a really interesting point, and it's an observation that I'm regretting that I didn't make myself in the book, which is that, just as you say, he had this intuitive sense of what it meant to be a businessman that in some ways was very like prescient, right? Looking around when he was starting Patagonia, as you say, this is before the age of shareholder primacy in earnest. And many of the big American companies were still like really generous employers in a way that we would find hard to recognize today. And so, I mean, you're raising an interesting question that I don't have like a quick answer for, is why he even then had this really instinctual aversion to businessmen writ large. He would, anytime you called him a businessman, he would bristle. He called businessmen greaseballs. And he sort of had this deep sense of self-loathing about the fact that he had somehow become one himself. And in fact, this book, it's called Dirtbag Billionaire. What I've heard, I don't know if he's read it yet. I honestly don't. But the little feedback I got was that he didn't like the title, not because of the word dirtbag.
Because of the word billionaire.
Because of the word billionaire.
That's not how he wants to be remembered.
That's not how he wants to be remembered. Now, in full disclosure, he gives it away by the end of the subtitle. So, the full arc is in there. Nevertheless, this sense that he as an individual was someone who cared about, prioritized, let alone hoarded wealth for himself was anathema to his own self-conception.
Is there I don't know really the story of Esprit and North Face, but like, is there a contrasting story with his friend Doug Tompkins? Like, they from trapped in the ice cave together, their companies took pretty divergent paths. Like, how did that end up?
Yeah, big time. And I mean, one of the fun sort of subplots in the book is charting these divergent courses. And just briefly, I would say, Doug Tompkins, another instinctually brilliant entrepreneurial mind, founded North Face, sold it very early, not for a lot of money, founded Esprit with his then wife, first as Plain Jane, became Esprit, and boom, early 80s, this thing was a rocket ship, one of the biggest, fastest growing clothing companies in the country, starts making him a ton of money. And unlike Yvon, who's like still a dirtbag even to this day, Doug Tompkins is like driving a red Ferrari, has a private plane, nice, Francis Bacon triptychs in his San Francisco palatial living room overlooking the bay. I mean, he knows how to enjoy the finer things in life. And all the while, he's telling Yvon to do the same thing. Grow the business as fast as you can, scale it, sell it, take that money and do whatever the hell you want. That's essentially what Doug did. It was not without a lot of agita along the way. He and his wife had a falling out. Things got ugly. It was messy. But ultimately, Doug sold his interest in Esprit, walked away with a big chunk of change even back then. But then he did something pretty remarkable. Along with his wife, his second wife, Chris Tompkins, who, and this is all a part of the story, was the former CEO of Patagonia, who he met through Yvon. Doug and Chris Tompkins then embark on this 2-decade generational project to take the fortune he made from Esprit, buy up millions of acres across South America, and create a new series of national parks, which is one of the great conservation stories of our time. And another example of what you can do, right? If you make hundreds of millions of dollars, as Doug did, which was a lot way back in the 80s, even more. He enjoyed the finer things of life, and then he sort of thought better of it and started putting his money on the things he really valued, and that was nature. And he sold the plane, he sold the Ferrari, and he built the parks. And it's a real enduring tribute to their far-sighted understanding of philanthropy and conservation, that these parks now exist. I was down there with Chris Tompkins in the parks just last year, and it's a awe-inspiring experience to see what they created and conserved.
Do they credit that to Patagonia as part of why they ultimately did that? Like, is this also part of Yvon's legacy? Is that why it's in the book?
Yeah. Well, you remember how I said very early in the conversation that Yvon was really uncomfortable with attention of any kind?
Yeah.
Yvon and Patagonia funded a lot of those parks.
Yeah. I was gonna say.
A lot of Patagonia's money, a lot of the Chouinard's family money over the years went to Doug and Chris in the form of what they had called Tompkins Conservation. And they sort of used the Chouinard's money very quietly to support these parks. And so, that story is in there as well. It's not well known, but the Chouinards were instrumental in funding the acquisition of all that land. And sometimes Chouinard would actually make some of the purchases himself of adjoining pieces of property, because Doug got in so much political hot water. He was buying up so much land that the government of Chile at one point got worried that he was actually going to bisect the nation. And because, right, he was buying so much in this narrow stretch that he could actually break the nation in two, which they were a big strategic threat to the country's sovereignty. Yeah. And so that never happened, but it was emblematic of the fact that he became a real lightning rod for political criticism. And so sometimes Chouinard would come in and spend his own money buying certain parcels to sort of take some of the heat off Doug. But no, the four of them, Yvon and his wife, Melinda Chouinard, Doug Tompkins and his wife, Chris Tompkins, who ran Patagonia for decades. The four of them were as close as friends could be, and together really were central to this large-scale conservation effort.
One of the concepts that I'm really interested in is something I call mission transmission, which is basically that when a company achieves a certain level of internal coherence and external integrity, so it's like structured in such a way that it stands for some particular ethos, it doesn't fall in the shareholder primacy trap, never takes the heroin, right? It's like a healthy, vital organism, and is eager not just to avoid negative externalities and clean up rivers and stuff like that, but it's like hungry for positive externalities. Like, it has this mission and it wants to see the mission increased as much as possible. Eventually it starts to transcend its kind of like narrow personal interests and like it just doing its own customers, its own things. And it starts to see the ways in which it can transmit the power of its mission through its supply chain, through its partnerships, and even like through its alumni going off and doing other stuff. And when you talk story about the Tompkins, it just seemed like what an incredible story of this mission transmission of Patagonia having this indirect influence around the world. And I wanted to get in like that. To me, that's like a really interesting entry point into like, how did he build this company structurally, culturally, like from a, like management practices and kind of sense of purpose to solve these problems such that he could accomplish what most other companies cannot. And so if I could break it down, there's like, there's purpose, right? So it was a very clear sense of purpose, never fell into the shareholder primacy trap. He had this ethos that he brought with him, his personal ethos. And then he achieved integrity the most difficult way possible, which is simply by refusing to ever take any outside shareholders and owning the whole thing himself 100%. So that, again, not always replicable, but certainly very clear. And then then had this transmission. I know just from my own research, Patagonia has been instrumental in lots of different kinds of supply chain effects, building out, organic cotton and taking pollution and all kinds of negative externalities out of its own supply chain, doing public advocacy, trying to get people kind of to buy into its broader movement, including, I think even did like a "Don't Buy This Jacket" campaign. And like they've done a lot of things that came as kind of a sacrifice in the short term, but nonetheless have built up this big idea. So I just wonder, like, looking at through that lens of this like highly concentrated, coherent thing, broadcasting this mission out through the world, Like, how was that accomplished organizationally, culturally, managerially?
Such a great observation, and I'll try to break it down. I think the first thing I would say is you talked about sort of institutional and organizational structural efforts to do this. On that front, like Patagonia is no model of like organizational excellence, right? Like I just got to say, like the degree to which it was like an ad hoc, messy, often contradictory, at the whims of the founder, the board saying one thing, the executive team hearing a different thing from the family. Like this was a often messy effort to run this company. And I heard that from so many executives I talked to. I think even Chouinard himself, if pressed, would probably acknowledge that like his forte is not as a laser focused sort of operations minded manager.
How many visionary founders can we say that about him? That's a very common issue. Yeah.
Absolutely. But I think, as what we also often see is that fine, there's that growth stage where a founder needs to set the vision, set the product path, and then they bring in a real professional manager. When Yvon brought in his first sort of full-time CEO, which was Chris Tompkins, who I had just mentioned, she was literally like a 25-year-old in bare feet who had been packing the boxes, right? But he just trusted her. And so there's literally like the few times that they've tried to bring in professional managers into Patagonia, the body has rejected the organ almost immediately. Like these people just do not fly.
They don't get it because they don't get it.
They don't get it.
Like Jim McInerney coming into 3M is kind of what I have in mind. Yeah.
And who was Jim McInerney's mentor?
Jack Welch, of course.
Jack Welch.
And for those that don't know, as soon as the organ rejected him at 3M, he was immediately hired by Boeing, where he oversaw the 737 MAX program. So, just for context.
Oh my gosh. I'm having like PTSD thinking about all that. Okay.
I shouldn't be smiling. It's actually terrible.
So listen, Chouinard was never like the most effective or disciplined manager. I can't say that there were like, really well thought out ways of sort of imbuing this into corporate culture. There were weird and like very Patagonia versions of it, right? Like he would take employees on vision quests and like take them hiking for 2 weeks and talk to them about philosophy. And there were indeed philosophy classes on site. So that was sort of the way.
What are they teaching the philosophy classes on site? I got to know.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And again, like I get into some of the classes in the book, but there were these elliptical lessons on what it means for something to be quality. And so, for example, Chouinard himself would teach some of these classes, and he would get up in front of a group of Patagonia employees and he said, describe to me a quality shirt. And someone would say, a quality shirt. Like, well, the finest shirt in the world is like, an Italian fine cotton, beautifully hand tailored.
Yeah.
And Chouinard would say, bullshit, right? Put that through the washing machine a couple times and tell me what it looks like. If it falls apart after a few washes, can you consider it to be quality? And people would say, oh, maybe not. If it stretches, if it loses its form, if it holds a stain, is it quality? Like, no, definitely not. And so he would get people thinking about what is the true essence of what it means for something to be a quality product. And so that's just one example, but he would sort of engage in these almost sort of Socratic method debates with people, trying to get them to sort of distill what it means for something to be not just quality, but what does it mean to be in the service of nature? And why, how are we as consumers, as citizens, as executives connected to the natural processes? So these are very ephemeral, like weird conversations, but those were sort of core to the culture of the company. But I would finally just add that, when you think about Patagonia's legacy, it's not the same as GE's legacy, right? Like we just mentioned Jim McInerney, but in my previous book about Jack Welch, I document dozens of executives who had come up through the ranks at GE, went on to work at other big American companies, screwed those ones up too. There's not the same sort of family tree effect at Patagonia. Mm-hmm. Sure, there's some alum at some other big companies, but where I think you really can see Patagonia's fingerprints across corporate America are in things like the textile exchange and 1% for the planet and time to vote and the Regenerative Organic Coalition, all these efforts and the B Corp movement that Patagonia had a hand in starting, in nurturing, that all were in the service of sort of reorienting corporate America as a whole to take a more ethical, more values-based approach to critical issues. And to understand that like one little company out of Ventura, California has been instrumental in creating all these different corporate movements that are still going on decades later and have had these ripple effects that are reconceiving how we think about what a company is for. What is the purpose of business? That, in my mind, is where you really see sort of, what did you say? The mission transmission, if I got it right.
You got it.
Of Patagonia.
That's really beautiful. And one of the things I think, it's funny, this contrast between the kind of servant leadership with Yvon and what we see in so many of these egomaniacs is there's also, I think one of the critical things about that story is there's leadership and followership in the story. So like there's all these things that he did himself and that Patagonia was like, this is our initiative to do this thing, but they've also signed on and quietly let their weight and status to all these other movements. I mean, think like obviously when you mentioned the B Corp movement, of course, that's what I was thinking about. Like how much legitimacy did that give to that movement? And they didn't feel it was necessary that other companies be certified as Patagonia companies. That would have been self-defeating, especially because you're not going to get any egomaniacs to sign on to your thing. They have to sign on to their own thing, but to do that quietly, I feel like that is also extremely distinctive of their style. And you see it in these companies that have that asymmetry in them. Again, relatively small. I was thinking of Tony's Chocolonely in the Netherlands, which is a similar company that is they make chocolate, slavery-free chocolate. And they're like a reasonably sized company, make like 200 million euros a year, size. But they're the number one chocolate provider in the Netherlands, but they've also had a lot of success in other places. But they have this massive disproportionate impact beyond their own supply chain because they built this open supply chain that other companies can sign on to. But in order to sign on to their thing, you have to commit to their like ethical principles in all your dealings. Yeah. So you can't just use their product to produce an organic, ethical chocolate bar while you're also producing conventional chocolate bars. You have to commit that all your chocolate is going to be sourced with them. So like most Americans only know Tony's because it's the chocolate behind Mr. Beast's candy bars.
Oh really? Well,
a Mr. Beast chocolate bar.
My kids have some Feastables in the fridge, so now I feel
yeah, exactly. If you have kids of a certain age, they definitely know who Mr. Beast is and they know about Feastables. And if you're of a different age, people have no idea what we're talking about right now. But anyway, they've had this incredible asymmetric impact, pulling so many children out of slavery, which is admirable, but it's also through this mission transmission, this ability to influence much larger systems simply by having this deeper commitment. And as we talked about, having the integrity to be able to do it in the face of outside pressure.
Yeah. So
let's talk about the trust, because to me, that is one of the most interesting parts of the story. And I remember when it happened, it was such big news. I study these things, so it was huge news in my world when they did this conversion. But it happened to be around the same time, and I'm blanking now on the name of the guy. A different company was sold to private equity around that same time by by someone who was devoted to conservative political causes. So a lot of people in the press wrote this story as like a nice trend story. Here you have two different companies who are converting to engage in political activism. And it's the same thing. And I thought that was such a wild framing because one company was literally liquidated and the other is still around, is going to be around forever. And the idea that we in our society now cannot tell the difference between a thing being liquidated and a thing achieving immortality because we only see things through the lens of the financial worth of the transaction. We become so transactional in our mindset and we can't tell the difference. And I thought that was totally wild. So talk about first of all, like the lead up, to me, this is like the ultimate test of integrity is, can the organizational ethos survive succession? If the original founder dies, or if a private equity firm comes knocking, or, whatever the case may be, do you have the fortress to resist that outside pressure? And so until he did that, I think I would have said Patagonia is still an open question. Because are his kids going to run it with the same devotion as he is? Are they going to be dirtbags too? Or is he going to pass it on to some other person? Or is he going to have it be owned by it's this like problem that has bedeviled corporations that have any kind of ethical commitments for like 200 years now. We see it over and over and over again. People reinvent this this rediscovered the same principle that if you treat people well, if you stand for something, you could make a lot more money. These companies are super valuable because they're trustworthy, because people like them, and therefore they're more attractive targets to be taken over. Yep. Because if you take them over, if you gain control of them somehow, you get all this trust, which you now can abuse to make as much money as possible. I mean, not to bring Jack Welch back into the story, but his proteges did that in company after company all across America. So how did he first get the idea to solve the succession problem this way? And tell us that story of ultimately what the structure wound up being.
So for years, I mean, dating back to the 90s, he was already anticipating this conundrum towards the end of his life. He understood that he wanted Patagonia to keep operating in a certain way. He didn't want to sell it for the money after he flirted with the idea. And he knew that there was going to become a time where this had to get resolved. And the truth is, he just kept kicking the can down the road because, he was young enough and the company was doing well enough and he was busy enough that he didn't have to think about it. That all changed in 2018, I think it was, 17 or 18, when for the first times, Forbes magazine put him on their list of billionaires. Well, and when that happened, he freaked out. He was like, oh my gosh. He says this is one of the worst days of his life. And he went around the office screaming at people, raising his voice, saying, get me the fuck off that list. Like, do not rest until we fix this, because I refuse to be on that list. But year after year, he kept getting on that list because they couldn't figure out, like, well, what's the answer? You want to sell the company? No, I don't want to sell the company. Well, then you're a billionaire. Like, tough shit. Figure it out, right? And there was
you own 100% of this company that makes $1 billion a year. It's a fact.
Right. And so in COVID, right, as so many things were like stirred up by COVID hits, and they're like, we really have to figure this out. And so a process began, right? It was an internal corporate process. It got its own code name. It was called Project Chacabuco. The deputy general counsel, a couple other internal folks, the CEO at the time, and they were he tasked him with it. Figure out an option. Bring it to me, right? Like, I'm serious. And he said, if you don't figure it out, I'm going to get the Forbes magazine list of billionaires and start calling people and offer to sell the company. And I hope things will work out, but I refuse to be on that list anymore. Okay. They figured he was serious now.
A credible threat. Yeah.
They came up with a series of options, but none of them really satisfied all these concerns, right? And it was a pretty short list. He said, number one, Patagonia sort of needs to continue to operate much as it does. Number two, I don't want to own the equity, and my kids don't want it. Number three, we want more of the money, as much of the money as possible, to go toward the causes we care about, namely like environmental activism, conservation. So figure that out. It wasn't obvious. Finally, in early 2022, I think it was either late 21 or early 22, they bring in a guy named Dan Mosley from private bank called BDT. It's a boutique, bank. Byron Trott, Warren Buffett's banker, famously runs this firm BDT. And
they do a lot of family-owned companies.
Exactly. Well, exactly. And here it is. Dan is one of these like brilliant estate minds. He very quickly sort of surveys it, talks to the family, understands their priorities. Boom, boom, boom. He comes with a structure no one's ever thought about. And here's how it works. Patagonia, as we mentioned earlier, dual class company, all of those shares, though, owned by the Chouinard family. Dan says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to set up a new purpose trust, a California incorporated purpose trust. We're going to put 100% of the voting shares, which is equivalent to 2% of the overall shares, into the purpose trust. You're going to pay tax on that because that's not a tax exempt event. So you're going to pay taxes on that to the tune of about $17.5 million. Boom. $7.5 million. Pay that tax bill. Boom. The other 98% of the equity, and the company is now valued at somewhere between $3 and $6 billion. The other 98% of that, we're going to put into a series of new nonprofit 501c4, not 501c3, 501c4 corporations called the Holdfast Collective. The fact that they are 501c4 has two important implications. Number one, the monies in those foundations can be used for political purposes. So if you want to fund campaigns, you can go do that. However, you do not get a tax benefit for donating into those corporations. And so there is no tax benefit for that 98, for that like 1.3 or, roughly billions of dollars of donation. So then here's the way it works now. All right. So the equity, the voting shares are in the purpose trust. The purpose trust instructs the California C Corp, still a privately incorporated C Corp in Patagonia, to distribute all of its earnings that are not reinvested in the company into the Holdfast Collective, which is the holder of both the 98% of the equity, but more important on an operational basis, the vehicles through which Patagonia's profits, which are roughly $100 million a year, are distributed on an ongoing basis to the causes the Chouinards care about. And that's how it works. Mm-hmm. And that's how it is. And listen, is this a bulletproof solution? Maybe not, right? Will there be people running the Patagonia Purpose Trust in 20 years from now or 50 years from now who have a different version of what it is? Perhaps. Are there vulnerabilities? Of course. Is it an incentive? Is it a corporate structure that incentivizes Patagonia to make the most money and make the best products? Jury's out on that one. But is it a structure that the Chouinards feel like preserved their intentions and allowed them to sort of close the book on their ownership chapter? Yes. And I think that's remarkable.
The trustees. How do they pick the purpose trustees? Do you know?
It's essentially the friends, and it's essentially the family and their friends at this point. And the children are still involved. They'll be a part of that process on an ongoing basis. But, at some point, their children may be on the trust, the board of the trust, or, their children's, or who, God knows what's going to happen. So again, you can't fully predict the future, but the belief is this is a structure that was literally as good as they could make it for now.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Did they carve out some provision for the family economically or no?
So I don't have access to the family's bank accounts, and the family does have a family office. I have asked, but never been told exactly, how much their assets are worth. But when I broke the news about the ownership change when it happened in 2022 for the Times. And I asked Chouinard multiple times on the record. I asked multiple other people involved in the company on the record, like, does the family have like tens of millions of dollars in cash, socked away that's just like spitting off, interest that they can live off? And the answer, like he swore at me when I asked him that. He's like, fuck no. Right. And so again, I don't have a specific number. What I can tell you is that they own their homes, they live comfortable lives, they travel where they want to travel. But I genuinely don't believe it's a case where they have, hundreds of millions sitting in an offshore account, sort of spitting off dividends. Again, I can't know. If someone has those documents, send them to me.
Yeah, they should get on Signal and they should send them to you right away.
Please do. I'm on Signal.
It's super interesting. It reminds me a lot of the Grundfos company in Denmark, which at the end of the founder's life, he transferred, I think this is like 60 years ago now, ownership into a nonprofit foundation. That foundation has trustees who oversee the for-profit company. Now they have external investors and shareholders, and they've been able to manage this structure very stably. But I remember reading the charter of the foundation, which is a public document. They're actually a charitable foundation. Is at the top level, what I call the spiritual holding company, like the thing at the top that holds the soul of the whole enterprise, no matter how many other entities there are. And they have a structure where it's like 4 members of the family in perpetuity, 4 executives from the actual operating company. And then they have a constitution that shows they can have 4 other like luminary business executives, people who have like direct operating experience that is relevant to the thing. So they've like built like basically a constitutional structure with like different factions balancing out the interests. And that structure has proven very stable. There's all these companies that have been doing it. I think Zeiss, if you ever had Zeiss lenses put in your glasses, they formed that trust structure in 1888. So it has some durability to it. And it's funny that they only considered it at the end as this esoteric thing. This is the thing I really wanted to ask you about. And this also ties into the Jack Welch thing. So I've been trying to convince people to adopt this structure from the beginning, because you don't have to pay a $17 million tax bill if you just set it up properly in the first place. Then you never, ever, ever have to worry about succession. It's all very straightforward. And what's wild to me is that most advisors, bankers, investors, lawyers, if you talk to them and say, I'm thinking about setting up this structure, they look at you like they've never heard of it before. Like it's some kind of wild and speculative thing. And even it sounds like that's kind of how they treated it for Patagonia, like they were inventing something new that's never been done before. And I think it's like, to me, the most ultimately fascinating expression of the shareholder primacy like era has this like orthodoxy to it. It kind of reminds me of like, you know, the development of the original religious orthodoxies. It's not only is this the best way, it also needs to be the only way. So it's not, and I always like, people always tell me the current way we build companies is the only and best way. I'm always like, you realize you have to pick one. It can't be the only and the best. That's a contradiction. Right. It's the only. And so it's really interesting to me. And I've now been through so many entrepreneurs having these conversations with their investors. It's like, look, just because it's new to you doesn't actually mean that it's new. These structures have been studied. There's like actually a vast academic literature on even the question you asked about will the absence of disciplining by the market lead to underperformance. There's enough of these companies that we've studied that question. It turns out, no, they have superior return on invested equity. They invest more in R&D. They invest counter-cyclically during downturns. Like I could do this all day. You know, it's just super, super clear. And when you talk to the academics who study this, you ask them, hey, if this is such a good model, how come everyone doesn't do it? They're all like, I don't know. Like, I guess nobody does it. And the thing I really wanted to ask you about, so I understand he's a very private person. I understand that Patagonia has been very like interior focused and wants to do its good works privately. And the idea that the Forbes billionaire list is a thing that was a prompt for him to get off the list is like so the opposite of some certain very famous people who have spent an awful lot of their lives trying to lobby to make sure they get themselves on the list and higher up and whatever. What an incredible contrast. But one of my observations is that precisely because this like ethical kind of purpose-driven way of running business is so effective as a private conviction, like it's like the opposite of virtue signaling. You can do it and you never have to tell anybody that you do it. As a result, we have this kind of funny thing where the public discourse is dominated by the opposite. The loudmouth people, the people trying to spend billions of dollars convincing everybody that there's only one way, get all the airtime and the attention. And therefore, a lot of people who kind of have these convictions, whether they're founders or leaders or executives or board members, kind of feel lonely because they're like, gosh, I guess I'm the crazy one.
Right.
And I wonder if in all your conversations with him and in his reflections on it, and just, you know, having written the book on Jack Welch also, like, what are your thoughts about the obligations of people who have this conviction? Like, how do we counteract the fact that they are keeping it private, like almost like a hidden personal source of competitive advantage, but they're not lending their voice to the establishment of a standard, or the establishment that like, hey, there's actually an alternative path that does not put profits and people in antagonism, but recognizes that it's literally impossible to put profits over people, because what it means to make a profit is to maximize human flourishing.
We've said it a few times now, he's an intensely private person. And while it is the case that he always talked about, you know, running Patagonia and continuing to operate it as a opportunity to show businesses that there was another way to do it, it's also the case that he never really embraced the role of being the chief evangelist. He sort of left the details of how Patagonia was going to do that to be figured out on the fly. And as a result, listen, it would be, you know, in an alternate universe where Chouinard was someone who loved the limelight, you could imagine him as being a incredibly like powerful, enduring, charismatic voice for these issues. That's just not who he is. That's just literally, I spent a lot of time with the guy. Like, he's truly not the man he is. There's almost nothing he would rather not be doing than like media interviews about these kind of topics, right? Like the man wants to be alone in the woods and fishing. So like, do companies have an obligation? Like perhaps, but I'm always a little reticent to sort of tell other people or companies what it's their responsibility to do. I think what I hope, and it's really a big reason why I wrote this book, especially after writing the Jack Welch book, is that more people through all sorts of ways, including my work on this project, come to understand the sort of the depth and complexity of this story, because it's not a straight line and it's not a narrative without its contradictions. And yet for those of us who have spent a lot of time thinking about corporate America, thinking about what it means to be in business, thinking about how it is that executives and workers and companies can show up and do things with integrity and with values, this is a narrative that powerfully answers some of those questions. And it's not perfect. And it's not, again, without all sorts of like flaws and missteps and contradictions. And, Chouinard, as I documented in the book, was not always a nice guy to be around. And nevertheless, when you sort of take in the entire arc of what he's done in his career and what this company has managed to accomplish, it stands in such remarkable contrast to the vast majority of other corporations out there that it's just clear to me that there are deep lessons in here that I think we all need to be really attuned to.
One of the ideas that it powerfully evokes for me is that the very fact of its imperfection and its in some ways incoherence at moments is actually like a tell in itself. Because if that's what mattered the most, if like the most important thing, again, this is not to make everything about Jack Welch today, but like the old GE model was that like what matters is the professional manager, and any company can be professionally managed. And if it is professionally managed, like you can achieve greatness with it. If that was really true, you wouldn't see these success stories with all this mess in them. To me, it's like when in this podcast, we talked a lot about these companies where like they take the harder road on purpose. Mm-hmm. They do stuff that other people would say like, you're taking on way extra work. Just do the simpler thing. But like I call it harder is easier. So you do the harder work of like having an ethos, of committing to do something in a principled way, to have this really expansive mission. And when you do that, it like activates these magnetic powers that I feel like we don't talk about enough, or don't even really understand, even in management theory, why they happen. That like people have tremendous loyalty to you. Your employees like feel incredibly passionate at work, bring their whole selves to work, and you unlock all this creativity. Customers will drive across town to shop at, they'll only buy your brand. They feel that they're like relentless evangelizers of your things. You don't have to pay all this money on marketing. You have these like partnership opportunities. You just summon allies to you somehow. They just like come out of the woodwork. And of course you get this automatic alignment in business, which to me, when I talk to conventional companies, the number one thing executives complain to me about is how hard it is to get anybody to listen to them, even in their own companies. They're like, I tell people what our strategy is. We do these strategy offsites and retreats, and we spend all this money on what's called employee comms, which I think is so funny. And after all that, they still do the wrong thing. And so people complain to me about how hard business is. It's so hard to get people to do what I say. I can't find talent. I can't this and that. And I'm like, meanwhile, those same people are like, yeah, but what Yvon did, that's too hard. I don't know, man. It seems to me like by taking the harder path, you unlock this magnetic attraction. It makes everything else easier. And then business can be very forgiving. You can be an incompetent manager in some ways, right? You could hire the 25-year-old non-professional CEO and say like, we'll just figure it out as we go. Like there's all these bits of the story where it doesn't make sense, but it does make sense because he activated something larger and more elemental than these more surface level concerns. And so I wonder if there are parts of the book or parts of his story, even if they're not in the book or whatever, just that you've encountered that illustrate those magnetic powers. Like, have you seen that in your research?
Yeah, there's one example that's coming right to mind. And, by this point, I don't know how much you could attribute it to Yvon himself, right? Because this is more recent. He's largely out of day-to-day management by this time. But he's created a company, as we've discussed, where the values, his original principles, the values are still animating the place. And here's what happened. I don't know, some we're in the 10 to 15 years ago range. The company had always had problems with its supply chain, right? Like the deeper you look in a supply chain, the nastier it gets, especially as when you're beyond your tier 1 suppliers, you're into, the tier 2 suppliers that's making the fabric that is being sent to the factory to make the jacket. Then you go to the tier 3, which is making the dyes that are going in the fabric, right? Patagonia, they've been looking at tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers for a long time. And every time they looked deeper, it just got ugly. So finally, they were like, we keep doing this. So we're going to start a new process rather than sort of playing whack-a-mole. Before we accept any new supplier, we're going to send teams of our own employees out to inspect the factory. And if there's anything wrong with it, if they're muddying up the soil, if the workers are being mistreated or underpaid, if it's, the whole thing reeks of incompetence at some level that we're just not comfortable with, we're just going to say no. We're just not, we're going to do proactive vetting to make sure all of our partners, as deep as we can go, are ethically aligned. And then they did a critical thing. They empowered people in a part of the organization who were not at all going to be measured by business success to make those decisions. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm getting here at is the issue of incentives, right? Yeah. In Boeing, in the culture that Jim McNerney ultimately helped create, quality was ultimately up to people, and safety issues were ultimately at the hands of people who were incentivized to produce the plane quickly. Those are fundamentally different missions, right? If you are incentivized to create a plane quickly, you are almost by definition not going to be fully incentivized to create a plane safely, if safety means it's going to take an extra 9 months. Mm-hmm. Bam, you're at odds with yourself. Patagonia said, all right, we care deeply about this value, that we want to be as good as we can. We'll never be perfect, but we want to try real hard on the issue of supply chain quality. And so we are going to take the vetting process out of the business operation side and give it to a totally different team that is not at all incentivized whether they say yes or no. And what that did was relieve, right? The business side was then like, well, like we'll work with what we can, but if we don't have the factory, then we can't do whatever sales target we may have set for ourselves.
Totally.
Right. And
such
the
a straightforward
team,
and simple thing to do. It actually makes everyone's life so much easier.
The vetting team's like, we're just telling you yes or no. This factory is or isn't on our list. And all of a sudden it was like, oh, there's a structure where that sort of values are being transmitted, right? And it's sending a signal like, here's what we value. Here's how it shows up. And the business is going to be what the business is going to be because of it.
What's funny is that conventional companies already do that in the finance function. Mm-hmm. If you think about like even these companies that are hyper fixated on maximized shareholder value, so if you're like, well, we need to cut corners in the production of the quarterly reports, it's like, oh, no. I'm sorry. That is a sacrosanct responsibility. We have to report on time every time, no matter what it costs. And I remember working with a very, very large company where the production of the consolidated reports took, if I get this right, 1% of the company's global workforce, 1 month out of every quarter was spent, the total labor cost to produce these reports. It was like an astronomical undertaking. And not a single time did anyone ever say like, oh, sorry, we're over budget. We can't afford that. We gotta, it's like all the same arguments if any other initiative in the company costs that much, we'd be neutron jacking it to oblivion, obviously. And it's like, no, that is a sacred responsibility. So we actually even our modern setup, we know how to do things. Companies are exceptionally good at the things that they care about. And I always push people on like, if you have these companies where you can't trust if they care if you live or die, but you can trust that they'll report quarterly on time every time. Like, what's up? Are you telling me that that's natural human morality? Like our inner alignment deep in our hearts is to quarterly reporting over the welfare of other humans. Therefore, it's always this way. It's like, no, of course not. To achieve this outcome, we have to have a non-incentive aligned apparatus. And in fact, the chair of the audit committee in almost every corporation has a direct line of access to the CFO and the controller to make sure that if they are ever incentivized to do the wrong thing, they can whistleblow directly. It's just like so obvious that you would do that. And then as soon as you're like, well, could we do the same thing for our mission, for our ethics, or for anything else that we care about? People are like, you're talking about the end of capitalism, man.
Right.
And I just think that is totally nuts. So go riff on that a bit with me. Like, what other lessons or like stories, because my job is to counsel entrepreneurs to follow in these footsteps. Okay. This is like a gold standard story of entrepreneurial excellence. And I know lots and lots and lots of people that would just be delighted to have a company that makes quote unquote only $1 billion a year. So they'd be real happy. So it's not like they had to give anything up. It's not like Yvon had to like give up on his dream of having an impact to do this ethical stuff. The ethical stuff became his competitive advantage that powered him to this success. What are other takeaways or lessons, stories that you think other people could emulate if they want to do this stuff like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, gosh, on the one hand, Patagonia is, as you say, like a gold standard. On the other hand, it's really hard to replicate some of these things because they've been doing them for a long time. And so when I talk to Yvon and I say, like, what's your message to other companies? He often says, like, if you're already a public company, it's too late. right? And that's sort of a fatalistic view, and I don't agree with him necessarily. I think there are, public companies.
But we know what he's talking about, yeah.
Public companies can get better. And I think on balance, right, like we've got a long way to go. But if you look at the arc of corporate America over the last 20 years, I think on balance, you could make an argument that in many ways, corporate America has gotten better on a number of issues and metrics. So that's for a different conversation. Mm-hmm. What he does say is that like he's trying to inspire the people who haven't started companies yet to do it right. Yeah. And I think in his mind, what that would mean is number one, right? Like getting straight with yourself, that it's not just about money, right? Like if you're in it for the money from the get-go, it may already be too late. Like this may not be a conversation you should be having.
Go take a different job. This is the worst possible job for making money.
You should you're not like the mission driven like book club is maybe not like the right room for you. Understanding it's not all about the money. Then understanding like what is, he always talked about quality. Quality is like this through line of the book, through line of his thinking. And, for him, it's sort of easy to understand quality when we're talking about clothing. But I think he would bring the same perspective to any good or services, right? Like, what does it mean for something to be quality? And really aim to deliver that in a deep and abiding way. And if you do that, then I think like, all right, yes, right? Like make products that people don't find disposable, make services that people feel like truly add value and find indispensable. And then when it comes to the culture, the team, right? Like he wrote a book called Let My People Go Surfing. In many ways, Patagonia has taken good care of its employees over the years. Here, I just absolutely need to acknowledge that the animating force behind a lot of the HR moves of the company was not Yvon, it was his wife, Melinda. This woman is an absolute firebrand who is even more press shy than her reclusive husband. I mean, like good luck finding an interview with her on the internet, like doesn't exist. And yet it is Melinda more than Yvon who has had this monumental impact on shaping the culture and really putting people, and especially women, at the center of Patagonia's decision-making over the years. So like Melinda just gets enormous credit. And I think they would say like, take real good care of your people. Now, does that mean paying them like the best? No, it means paying them well. But it means like understanding all the other ways that that employees have to show up in life and accommodating for that, right? Whether it's time in nature, whether it's time with your kids. And then I think that the higher level, like if we're going up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's like, all right, like what is the company ultimately for? If it's not for you, if it's not for the money, if it's not to like make the employees rich, what is that purpose? And then if companies can figure out how they want to use the profits that they do generate to make a, positive impact in the company, well, go for it. And here, like, let's just acknowledge it gets super subjective real fast, right? Like the Hobby Lobby folks are trying to make a positive impact by like restricting reproductive access. Other people are going to have a very different view on whether that's a positive impact in the company. Other people have different views on whether Chouinard should be trying to conserve land. Like other people think it should be exploited for natural resources development. So it gets subjective.
I'm sure it's controversial even within the environmental
quickly here. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up because one of the things I find so fascinating in discussing corporate purpose and stuff like this is that people, as soon as you bring up a kind of ethical or moral dimension to business, people immediately assume that you are trying to regulate business to say that there should be one standard and you're going to judge. People are like, who are you to say? Right. And it's like, hold on. We're not saying that there is one true purpose of business, but that we live in a market economy. Every company should be free, but also required to disclose what its purpose actually is. And then we can let the market decide. Like to me, what I think is really fascinating about the Patagonia story is it didn't require some act of Congress to permit them to do this thing. They plant their flag on this set of values. And then, this is like the opposite of let the market decide, like from a moral question. It's like, no, we fix the moral commitment and then we see what the consequences are. Now, the research is unequivocally clear for those that are just tuning in, just so you know, the research is super clear that companies that take this seriously and that commit themselves to some higher purpose have all these unbelievable business performance metrics that cannot be explained by the dominant economic and managerial theories of today. So they're like this total black hole mystery, and as such are not taught in business school as examples of corporate excellence, but rather as examples of corporate social responsibility. It's been like shunted off to a separate class. Think about the famous story of Volvo giving away the patent to the seatbelt. Everyone knows that story in business, taught in every business school in the world. And it's taught as just like a social responsibility thing, ignoring the fact that by current estimates, the Volvo safety brand is worth between $5 and $10 billion, 5 and 10 billion euros. So it's like, were they giving it away, or it was like savvy like a fox, crazy like a fox, right? Like it turned out to be this thing. And I always ask people to imagine you had the Volvo seatbelt in your back pocket and you took it to your board. He said, hey guys, I know what we should do with this patent. Let's not license it to other people. Let's give it away for free. Would your board really be like, oh yeah, that's going to get us $10 billion of value and make us, the dominant? It's just like this. No, we can't imagine replicating it. We could only imagine admiring it from afar. So one of the things I certainly have taken from our conversation and from Patagonia in general is this idea that this doesn't have to be a one-off, quirky thing that's just somebody did this one time. But everything you're describing, it's like there's no superhuman acts in the story. Right. It's like very mundane entrepreneurial, just like everybody else, just at certain critical forks in the road. They took a different fork than everyone is pressured to take because he had this personal ethos of not being, he's not tempted. He's like, to me, like, I'm trying to think of the right Tolkien analogy here. Like just was never tempted to grab the One Ring. So actually more, I was to say like kind of like Frodo, but more like Tom Bombadil is really for those who want a deep cut, just unaffected by this influence. So not everybody has to be a dirtbag to do this. But I feel like we can all take a little bit of inspiration from him to say like, okay, wait, do we really need what this system is offering us? Right. And I don't know. A lot of these billionaires seem pretty unhappy to me. Does he strike you as relatively content with his life?
He's deeply content. And he told me he could finally die in peace now that he's no longer a billionaire. And I think you just made a great point. This was a story that was like so human. From start to finish. And I think that's another thing that attracted it to me. Like I've interviewed Elon Musk, I've interviewed Zuck. Like I know what it's like up in the ether of corporate America. And it so often feels so detached from humanity and community and our sense of the place on earth. And this story from his early days, which of course I wasn't there with, to the development of the company and how they sorted out their values, to his deep commitment to conservation, which I got to see in person by walking through these parks, by being out in nature with him. At every level, it had this really organic quality of people trying to make the right decisions in the service of other people and our shared environment. And that is such a rarity these days. And I think it's why, against like this miasma of corporate bullshit we all exist in, it stands out as such a like refreshing and frankly, like oftentimes inspirational example of what it can be like. So that's what I got.
David, you talk about getting the perfect ending beat for the story. That is, you have the journalist knack for how to end a story. I appreciate. But I just wanted to say, before we wrap, how much I appreciate your reporting and just your willingness to tackle these issues. And obviously I love the story, and it's super useful because, like I said, they're so reclusive that nobody knows these details, and therefore they can sometimes seem very, very remote. But even with your book on Jack Welch, and even in your previous work on mindfulness too, I feel like so many journalists are so cynical. And we need skepticism. Like, I think it's great that you brought that rigor to this story, but it seems to me like you have been able to see also the beauty in it and to bring like the full range of the human experience of these stories out. And I say how much I appreciate that. So thanks for writing the book. Hold up. You have a copy of it, right? Hold up the cover so we can see. Everyone go out. We're going to time the release of this episode with the release of the book. So please, everyone go out and get a copy and enjoy the book. David, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Eric Ries Show. The Eric Ries Show is produced by Jordan Bornstein and Kiki Garthwaite. Research by Tom White and Melanie Rehack. Visual design by Reform Collective. Title theme by DB Music. I'm your host, Eric Ries. Thanks for listening and watching. See you next time.